Tonight, to officially launch this new work by Petra Bueskens is Manne. Anne is one of Australia's most penetrating cultural critics. A former columnist for The Australian and The Age, she now writes longer essays such as the cover piece in the May edition of the Monthly this year, Great Domestic Hoax, How the Economy Free Rides on Women's Unpaid Work. Her books include Motherhood, a Walkley finalist, a quarterly essay, Love and Money, a memoir, So This Is Life, and the best-selling The Life of I, The New Culture of Narcissism. She's now writing a new book on child sexual abuse. Her chapter, The Quest for Social Justice for Mothers, is just out in a new book, Dangerous Ideas About Mothers, edited by Camilla Nelson and Rachel Robertson. Please welcome Manne to officially launch Modern Motherhood and Women's Careers.
Serious, and I think this book deserves a serious introduction and a serious reading. I write because of the precision it offers, and then I read. So, excuse me if I do read from the script. Anne Summers has just brought out a memoir called Unfettered and Alive. It's a triumphant account of her highly successful career, which defied the then rather dismal expectations of a woman in the 1950s and 60s as she came of age, who was expected to marry and have children, and as she puts it, to be invisible except for living through those people, husband, children that she supported. Meanwhile, another leading feminist, Jane Caro, has a new book out early next year. It's called The Accidental Feminist, and it acknowledges a new cohort of confident and economically independent women, like Anne Summers, but she also acknowledges there's another group of forgotten women whose plight is perilous. Here's what Jane says. The book's to come, but there's a whole blurb, and I've just spoken with her somewhere, so I know something for argument. The fastest growing group, Jane says, among the homeless is women over 55. Women retire with half the super that men do. A third of women retire with no super at all. For some women over 50, the reward of a lifetime of paid work, domestic labour, and particularly caring for others, is a penurious old age. To which we should add single mothers, as Petra once was, who under harsh neoliberal policies have been more and more plunged into poverty, so that currently their poverty rates are hovering around between 20, a fifth, and 25%, a full quarter. And of course, even those who are not below the poverty line are still struggling. This is compared with 10% of poverty rate overall. So on the one hand, we may say, as individuals, women can lead lives now of freedom as never before. But on the other hand, all this data is telling us that women who are mothers are more likely to be poor. How can we find an explanation for such a stark disparity in fates? And the answer, I suggest, is in Petra Bueskens' brilliant new book, Modern Motherhood and Women's Dual Identities, Rewriting the Sexual Contract. And I'm thrilled to be here to launch it today. Petra places at the centre of her book this simple question: why are women both free and oppressed in late modernity? And what are the causes and consequences of this contradictory duality? Petra's book is theoretically sophisticated, but at the same time lucid, eloquent, and beautifully written. She has an arresting argument. In this new gender contract, even if they are promised freedom as individuals, as mothers, they nonetheless collide with a world where their largely unchanged responsibility for children and care entrenches patterns of gender inequality. The gender wage gap is in large part a motherhood penalty, leaving too many women impoverished in old age due to the care work they perform throughout their lives. This leaves women stranded in unforgiving cultural contradictions, which have only intensified under neoliberalism. She also presents original interviews with couples who break these age-old patterns, and she provides a kind of signposting, a roadmap to how we might transcend the impasse. I'll come back to her argument in a moment. When I first encountered Petra's writing, what I liked about it was an unusually thoughtful tone that she had, a quiet independence. And the fact that she's a kind of, I call it an integrationist. She takes complex, seemingly contradictory cultural strands, and then she weaves them together into an illuminating synthesis. But I especially liked how she was able to hold another person's perspective, respectfully acknowledging a different position without caricaturing it. And that's surprisingly common in public life in Australia, while simultaneously holding her own position steady. So in this way, she transcended a lot of the feminist tribalism, which can get somewhat nasty. So Petra is very different from those that Helen Garner described who think like tanks. In fact, she's nuanced, and she's always open, it seems to me, to the philosopher Raymond Gator's insight that thinking like a tank is no good because behind a political opponent's position could well be an echo of something true. Those qualities that Petra has are in abundance in this book. I also think these qualities are inseparable from and intertwined with her very particular life history as a mother, which she has generously and movingly shared in this book. Every writer, remarked Isaac Bashevis Singer, has an address. And Petra, in this book, shows us her address, her writer's address. She shares it as a part of her methodological rigour. The interviewer, researcher, writer is not, under feminist theory, a white-coated expert who sits above her research subjects, but is also self-disciplined enough to be reflective, to recognise the way she is shaped by her own subjectivity and her life practice. Petra became a mother unexpectedly in her early 20s to her beloved eldest daughter, Mia. We never forget how she's just been described, receiving her invitation into an honours course and a pregnancy test on the same day. This made Petra an outsider. She was an under-resourced single mother, albeit with wonderful family support, and she was living alone with responsibility for a lot of that time for a child, 24/7, on welfare benefits, some of that time, while studying, compared to what she saw as the responsibility-free life of her young 20-something peers, who, I'll paraphrase, perhaps inaccurately, sound a bit like Janis Joplin's Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll. So they were living the extended adolescent of late modernity, the individualist society we all know so well. Meanwhile, Petra writes, I adored my baby girl and took great pleasure in her blossoming self. But she was also an outsider, not just to her peers of her own age who were travelling and partying and so on, but to the life of the older women who were mothers, who were partnered and married, and who seemed to her to be trading off a degree of autonomy and equality in exchange for the cushioning of a male wage. So she saw two different patterns, which she was both an outsider to, but also were unsatisfactory. She was also an outsider, even though she's a person of high ability, talent and high ambition, to the lean in and manage like a man model of the uninterrupted career path, which was rapidly emerging as the default requirement for any woman who wanted to do something with her life outside the private realm, in media, business, medicine, law, and especially academia, for Petra. She writes, like many mothers, she no longer lived for herself, but rather for the emotional and physical needs of her baby, shaping her study and work around it. Her daily lived experience of the cultural contradictions of motherhood she writes about in this book was therefore more intense than most, and all the time she was doing it, notwithstanding the sexist idea that on becoming mothers, women's brains turn to vegetative mush, she was thinking long, hard and deeply. Someone as creative as Petra, I think, can transform difficulty into creativity, outsider status into insight. In sociology, the virtue of being an outsider has long been extolled. The psychotherapist and sociologist Irene Phillipson draws attention in a rave review of Petra's book in the US journal Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society to the sociologist Neil McLaughlin's idea of the optimal outsider. Someone outside the city walls might see things that those within the city walls don't. He says optimally marginal intellectuals have access to the creative core of an intellectual tradition while avoiding organisational, financial, cultural or psychological dependencies that limit innovations. As I see it, Petra has two central vocations. One is as the writer, theorist, feminist, psychotherapist and scholar who's written this book on modern motherhood, and the other is as a mother. In a recent essay, Petra wrote about Weber's idea of the spiritualised calling that he thought was a vocation. It brings meaning to one's life and ideally a contribution to the world, Petra wrote. However, it is possible, she says, and I think so many mothers would identify with this, it is possible to have more than one calling or central life pursuit. Once children arrive, there isn't really a choice around them being a central life pursuit, at least not for mothers, she says. I experience these two vocations as interwoven. One cross-pollinates the other. It is her vocation as a mother of Mia, and now in a second phase of motherhood of equally beloved Sophia and Tom, which has meant that she has taken another of Raymond Gaita, the philosopher's ideas, to take your time when it comes to thinking, philosophising and writing. This wonderful book took 10 years of living the problem, as well as the joys of being a mother, the best of times and the worst of times, of being at home as well as working sometimes full-time, as she did for 4 years, training as a psychotherapist, doing part-time work, studying and doing original research. Now we all understand slow cooking and how it might make a meal more flavourful, richer and more nourishing and celebratory of human beings when it is shared than a drive-through burger from McDonald's. And the principles of McDonaldisation, that is rationalisation, speeding up, have especially under neoliberalism colonised far more than the fast food industry. It often seems to me that Wittgenstein, for example, would never in modern academia have been given the time to write his famous philosophical investigations. Rather, he would be forced to churn out journal articles because they get more points, avoid a book-length investigation because a book gets fewer points, and presenting his key points in a slick PowerPoint presentation at a conference, which gets points. So what Petra has given us here, because of the way she has been living, so vividly described in the introduction, is the richness of slow scholarship, allowing the intermingling of spheres to give her more insight than might otherwise have been had, the ability to be original, the ability to move outside the silos, narrow silos often of academic speciality, and the cross-fertilisation of ideas from the life practice of being a mother. And she's combined all this into a precise and very serious scholarship. We see fully Petra's vocation as a scholar as she takes us in this book, travelling upstream from the current cultural contradictions of modern motherhood to its source, to the very foundation stones of modern democracy, tracing through 400 years of history, the history of the development of classical liberal thought and the development of the social contract. How women came to both be included in and excluded from the modern social contract. She revisits Carol Pateman's original and arresting intervention in democratic theory in Pateman's classic book, The Sexual Contract. Pateman herself is something of an outsider, and I'm interested that Petra has gravitated towards her. She was a working class girl who was never expected to complete secondary school, let alone go to, first of all, the working man's Ruskin College, then to higher education in Oxford, to do brilliantly, and then to write several absolutely brilliant books. And Pateman spent, perhaps as a result of her writer's address, thinking in brilliant, innovative ways around questions of inclusion. Now, I studied and actually taught political theory for a time, democratic theory and the development of the social contract at Melbourne University. So I know the area pretty well. In fact, the ghastly task of remembering all my different PIN numbers is made easy by using dates. You're all too nice to hack my by using dates of the extension of suffrage. So 1832, the Great Reform Act, 1867, which doubled for working men the suffrage from 1 to 2 million, 1868, which extended it to essentially all adult men in Britain, 1902, very important day in Australia, suffrage for women. This is one wearing my purple today, you see the suffrage colours. And 1928, full suffrage to women in Britain. And it's the only way I can remember them all. But it's also a very uplifting way of remembering it, because it is such an important thing that we moved away from the divine right of kings, we moved away from autocracy and developed a democracy. Petra first gives a very lucid account of Pateman's book, and I admit that I was really looking forward to reading it, but I didn't expect something new to develop, because I knew the work, all of this stuff on democratic theory quite well. And first she gives an account, and then she does something novel with it. So she shows, writing about Pateman, that as the new social contract emerged, replacing the hierarchical patriarchy embedded in the divine right of kings, in the move to a fraternal all men are equal universalistic doctrine, it was of course men who were the only ones who were able to participate as free and autonomous beings in the public sphere. And this happened, as Petra explains, by excluding women. This is Pateman's argument. By women being sequestered in the private realm, producing the next generation and taking care of the sick, the disabled, the elderly and children in the home. So freedom and equality for men then was contingent upon separate spheres, on the exclusion of women from the new social contract, and it meant inequality for women. These early exclusions from the social contract on the grounds of their sexual, reproductive and caregiving capacities are critical, travelling downstream, to the dilemmas contemporary women face, writes Petra, because the very category of individual has always presupposed an existence of a reserve army of flexible domestic and emotional labour that women have traditionally performed. And crucially, Petra shows, women cannot call on that same labour. With few exceptions, she writes, women cannot call upon that labour because they are that reserve labour. And then here's what's new. It wasn't contra Pateman just a story of exclusion. The fact is, as individuals, as that title and the Life of Anne Summers show, women have actually gradually been able, Petra argues, to take the opportunities offered by the new social contract as individuals. It is really on becoming mothers that a new reality bites, and an old, largely unchanged sexual contract kicks in. Modernity, she says, has enabled women as individuals, but disabled them as mothers. Women are free and they are subordinated. It just depends on which phase of the life course we are looking at. Moreover, such freedom or lack thereof is determined by the presence or absence of a child and the presence or absence of a husband or partner. Something Petra points out is patently not the case for men. Hence, the dilemmas we all face as modern mothers. Women are both meant to be self-supporting, self-fulfilling, autonomous individuals entering the labour market, looking after themselves. They're also meant to be self-sacrificing mothers who take care to put children's needs first so that they fulfil their potential. So they inhabit two distinct worlds where the assumptions of one are turned on their head in the other. A labour market where the assumption is of constant presence because the worker is assumed to have somebody else, a wife, to take care of the everything else. And on the other hand, the assumption of modern motherhood, which is also of a constantly present, engaged mother whose attentiveness is unconstrained by her obligations as a worker. There, in a nutshell, is the problem, stated so succinctly. Hence those widespread feelings women have that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, of accusations that you're a failure as a mother if you work and a failure as a mother as a poor role model if you stay at home, the problematic nature of either strategy and the defensiveness and conflict often between women over the best way of living. And I think there's an increasing model of effortless perfection in performing both roles, and that's the new straitjacket that the new problem with no, which hasn't probably been named yet. Being the imperfect employee while raising the perfect child. And apart from the psychological burdens of all this, it is why there are so many leakages from the pipeline in all the major professions. When it becomes, the clashes simply become indissoluble, unsolvable, and too much, and women withdraw from the workplace, partially or totally. In her book, Rewriting, it's in her book, Modern Motherhood, Petra also overcomes a very typical and problematic binary in academia, where often academics who are theoretical tend not to be empirical enough, and those who are empirical tend not to be theoretical enough. It's not a blanket statement, but it is a tendency. So she has an empirical section in the book where she gives an in-depth account of her unstructured and psychologically sensitive interviews with a group that lived a very different life to her. And she was actually studying these women while she was attachment parenting Mia, more or less. These mothers who overcome this default position of being the one to do everything on the home front spent longer than the average workday away from children. So they might spend 3 days away, or they might spend a longer workday. So it was a way in which they were able to work in an uninterrupted way, but also their partner, the father, was forced to actually do the kind of emotion work and psychological work that new mothers do, because women don't become a mother by giving birth to a child from their vagina. They just don't, or by breastfeeding. They actually become a mother over time, and it's learnt on the job, and there's a lot of trial and error, actually a lot of error. And as Sarah Ruddick once said, you make it up as you go along. So by actually leaving altogether, these men had to find out how to do it. So it really did overcome that idea that they were just babysitting, for example, while they became while the mother was away, they became true caregivers. Just on this point, I was reminded when I read Petra's book on this section of a father who, amongst the almost totally female population picking up kids from school and waiting for the older kids, was one stay-at-home dad. And we'd have really interesting conversations, and we would have mother-type conversations where he had clearly internalised all the interest of his child, and he was thinking about the next thing that the child needed, and whether they should learn this, and the difficulties they had about this and so on. But it was a very, I moved from the mother's group, this poor waif of a male who was sitting by himself over there, and then we would have a mother-type conversation. In contrast, I went about the same time to a very eminent gynaecologist, and he had, those photos where Ali Hochschild, the wonderful American sociologist, notes that men often have very posed and formal photos, whereas women have sort of snapshots they've taken themselves as a kid. So there are a lot of photos of, a child draped around a cello, or another with a violin, and there'd clearly been a professional photographer who'd come in and taken these shots of the offspring. But then he said to me, there were 3 children, and he said, I wasn't interested in them until they learned to speak properly. And as I was lying on the table, he was sort of rummaging in my nether regions. I was doing a calculus of just how long with 3 children it must have been that he wasn't interested in them. And I came as a calculation of between 9 and 15 years. This was borne out by the fact that the receptionist was clearly furious with this august personage, because the wife was forever trying to get appointments with him to sort of get his attention. So anyway, the 2 contrasts of what it is to really take responsibility for a child, and of course the very incompatibility of work and home as we currently construct it is seen by the way these mothers who left were able to really work in an efficient and productive way when they had uninterrupted blocks of time. And I should say that through this exploration of mothers who leave, I was again struck by Petra's signature quality, this uncommon psychological poise and her capacity to see other lives fully, in that while she was a single mother attachment parenting Mia, a mother who stayed, if you like, she was at the same time imaginatively entering the lives of mothers who were living very differently to her, without judgment or the need for self-justification. So, as a mother who stayed, she was able to see the revolutionary potential in the lives of those who leave. It's in this more empirical section that she also presents the telling evidence of the often dire consequences down the track of the sexual contract over the course of mothers' lives, which neoliberalism has made worse. We have only 18 weeks of parental leave, when it takes about 20 years to raise a child. So care responsibilities are simply not taken account of. Neoliberalism has also installed a rather pernicious idea that whatever befalls anyone but a mother is simply the result of their free, perhaps foolish choice. It's not a structural problem in urgent need of remedy, for which we need solidarity, bold thinking and a social movement to overcome. Rather, motherhood, as Petra says in her book, becomes constructed as an individualised risk. Or to put it in our new Prime Minister's language, in ScoMo speak, you have to have a go to get a go. You should make a contribution, not take a contribution. So that poor single mothers and older mothers who are poor and homeless clearly haven't had a go. And they apparently have not made a contribution in raising the next generation. They are leaners, not lifters. Except I point out that Australian Bureau of Statistics figures from 2014, using the most conservative, the most understated form of calculation, show that the contribution to the economy of almost entirely women's unpaid labour is equal to the value of 434 billion, or equal to 43.5, just under 50% of the value of GDP. So it's a huge unrequited contribution to the nation's well-being. Many mothers, Petra says sharply, are only a husband away from poverty. That's true. And it is ultimately motherhood that produces the gender pay gap, which translates into gender poverty. The specific effect on motherhood, on the gender wage gap, is startling. Petra has a lot of really interesting figures that she pulls together to show the consequences towards the end of life, but also during the peak child-rearing period of all of the difficulties she's been describing. The gender pay gap, sorry, I'll get it right soon, she shows actually grew to 18% in 2015 and only dropped slightly from that in 2016. But the usual forms of calculation do not take into consideration all sorts of things like after-hours work, bonuses, which men are more likely to be able to do because they have so much time looking after the children. So during prime childbearing years, Petra shows, the pay gap is nearly 40%, or over $1,000 a week. The consequences lifelong can be devastating. Superannuation is actually a contributory system, unlike the age pension. Those who have full-time lifelong work benefit the most from it. In 2016, close to 75% of women aged 60 to 64 have balances less than $100,000. Men held 63% of all super balances and women only 36%. Women are estimated, through looking after children, the sick and the elderly, to work only 28 full-time years compared to men's 38. Now, 34% of older women live in permanent income poverty. And the instability of marriage and relationships that Petra also details only adds to mothers' vulnerability. As one woman put it in Petra's book, I don't have property, I don't have big savings, I don't have anything behind me. And that's scary for me. Like, is my future living in a dustbin under a bridge somewhere? What Petra shows is that until we invent new forms of maternal citizenship, the work-family conflict, the inequality that she so powerfully shows will only get worse. Petra's key contention that women are now free as individuals and constrained as mothers deftly explains the unfettered and alive of Anne Summer's title and, if I may paraphrase, the fettered and poor subjects of the older mothers of Jane Caro's book. It is as mothers not as child-free individuals or as individuals in the early part of the life cycle, that women become or are more likely to remain economically disadvantaged. And I just want to say that as someone who has written a lot about motherhood, it is so intellectually and personally satisfying to read such a serious work of scholarship. I believe that being a mother deserves nothing less. And I think so to find, I actually moved away from writing about mothering. I thought it would be interesting for younger voices to come forward and for other people to write, and I'd written about it a long time. I also had other things, frankly, that I was really interested in. But in a way, I've been waiting for a voice, a certain sort of voice to come forward. And I believe that voice is Petra. I cannot think of a more original and radical and satisfying book able to excavate how we have got into this pickle, and which is providing an illuminating set of signposts on how we might extricate ourselves, and which offers hope and a way forward. Thank you.